Rome enters a transitional period, a new period in its history, in about 96 CE. This is when we have the assassination of Domitian. Domitian was an emperor who had been part of the same line that we talked about previously with Vespasian, etc. But Domitian was really kind of excessive. He demanded to be addressed as Lord and God by his people, and really angered the Senate. Ended up getting assassinated. After he died, a new emperor took the throne. His name was Nerva. Nerva had actually originally been a senator who was essentially elected by the rest of the members of the Senate. But he didn't rule for very long. He only ruled for about 16 months. But Nerva did something that was really kind of unusual. Nerva established a line of succession. So prior to this, typically when we talk about emperors succeeding to the throne, we talk about them, they're members of the same family. It's a dynasty, and this is like literally part of the same family. But what Nerva does is a little bit different. So rather than choosing someone who is related to him, Nerva adopts a grown man. So that way he's kind of maintaining the same concept of someone succeeding in terms of a family member, but it's not really somebody he's related to. So he chooses somebody. And what he ends up doing, Nerva chooses someone named Trajan. Trajan was actually a Spanish emperor when he eventually becomes emperor, but he was Spanish from descent, and he was a general, a leader in the army, and Nerva knew that he was a very good man for the job, so he adopted him. And when Nerva died, Trajan ascended to the throne. And Nerva did something else too. Is interesting. He required that Trajan adopt someone else as well, so that they could ensure a continual succession. And so what ends up happening here is you have this period in time where we have really significant stability in some of the greatest physical extent of the Roman Empire under this period that we call the High Empire. And what's unusual is that these emperors, rather than having a family member succeed them to the throne, they try to find someone who's the best person for the job and adopt them. And so that's kind of a different tactic, and it actually works out pretty well for a period of time. So Trajan adopts Hadrian, who also becomes emperor after him. We have Antonius Pius, Marcus Aurelius, and Lucius Verus, who ruled together, and then also Commodus. And then it's the end, really, of this period in history that we refer to as the High Empire. So we've talked a little bit about the concept of a forum, and a forum is really the heart of the civic administration of the Roman world. And when we look at various different structures, different examples of Roman civic structures, rather, we often find that, when you're dealing with domestic architecture and the structure of how everything's laid out, you've got the main roads that go through the city. You've got the Cardo, the Decumanus, and then these would often intersect, and that's where you'd look at a forum. Rome, of course, is the original city, so it's a little bit different. In downtown Rome, there are actually several forums, and forums were, again, the center of a civic administration and very important parts of the Roman world. And the forum, there actually were several in downtown Rome, if you will, and remains of several of which still survive today in varying degrees. There was a forum built by Julius Caesar, also a very popular forum built by Augustus. But what happens is that, during Trajan's reign, he conducts a series of military wars, incursions against the Dacians, which is in modern-day Romania, essentially. But these are very successful, and probably partially from the plunder, from the spoils of war, he's able to build a new forum in the heart of Rome. And this new forum is enormous. It is at least twice as large as any of the previous forums. And it no longer really survives intact. If you look at the site today, you can still see Trajan's famous column, which we'll talk about, and you can see the remains of some of the columns, some of the paving from the original structure, but it's really paved over and actually built over by a lot of medieval structures. So much of the forum at this point is just completely gone. He did also build a series of complex markets, so those were located adjacent to the forum, and much of the markets actually still survive today. The architect of this structure is also known to us. The architect is a man by the name of Apollodorus of Damascus, and he was actually Trajan's military engineer. who went with him on his campaigns against the Dacians. It's also well known for building a famous bridge across the Danube. But Apollodorus is probably one of the most influential and important of all the Roman architects that we really talk about. And he designed this massive forum that we see here. And the forum, has the typical format to some extent. You've got a large central area surrounded by a colonnade. But rather than being dominated by a temple, we have a massive basilica. And the basilica here you can see is longitudinal, and the sides of the basilica face out to us. Behind the basilica would be the column of Trajan, the famous column of Trajan, which is flanked on both sides by libraries. And behind that would have been actually the temple to Trajan, at least according to some descriptions. We don't know for sure where the temple to Trajan was originally located. Some recent scholarship actually suggests that rather than being located there behind the column of Trajan, it may have in fact been on the other side of the forum, but this is not entirely known. It was also surrounded by 4 hemispherical exedra on either side, and the porticos would have been filled with statuary and sculpture, including captured and defeated Dacians. And so we also see some connections here to earlier examples of Greek work, much as we see like with the Parthenon or even with the altar of Zeus at Pergamon, and that we have the images of these heroic and yet defeated enemies, which are a way also to express the power, in this case, of the Romans and their ability to defeat the Dacians. So here we're looking at an artist's reconstruction of the interior of the basilica. And this basilica is known today as the Basilica Ulpia, or sometimes just Trajan's Basilica. But Ulpia comes from from his last name, which is where we get this name, is from his family name. And the basilica had a colonnade on either side of the nave. You can see the central nave here with aisles on either end, and also had apses or semicircular hemispheres really on either end as well, rounded ends like we see on churches today in many cases. And this is actually quite significant because structures like this, the basilica, the Roman civic administration building, end up becoming the foundation for later Christian structures. And we'll see that early Christian buildings are really based on this same design. And so this, of course, is the famous column of Trajan. And this is really a pretty remarkable example. It's quite remarkable in the fact that it survives today. Very little of the rest of this site does. You can also here see some of the surviving columns, which would be part of the site as well. But it's a massive column, and it no longer has its original statue on top. It would have had a statue of Trajan at the peak here, but it now has actually a statue of St. Peter. It is 128 feet tall, and it's quite massive. It's actually hollow, and there's actually a narrow stairway inside, so it's actually possible to ascend all the way to the top of the column. It's carved in such a way that it is a high enough relief, and also was originally painted so that it can be visible, from ground level. But there also would have been libraries on either side flanking this, making it easier to view the narratives which are carved into the surface. The whole column is carved in a spiral-shaped frieze, so it wraps all the way around this 128-foot tall thing, all the way to the very, very top. There's about 150 different episodes, more than 2,500 different figures. And it's also remarkable in the fact that the base of this served actually as a sarcophagus, really. It contained an urn with the ashes of Trajan and his wife, Palatina. And that's really rare. We don't see that typically. There was really a big taboo with Roman culture, at least prior to Christian burials in catacombs and things, about burials like this being they needed to be outside of the city, and so this is kind of an unusual case in that he was buried right in the Forum of Rome, if you will, and so this is really a remarkable structure, not only for its complexity but also because of the fact that it survived. And in the next images here, we'll take a look at the column itself and talk a little bit about what it represents. So here we're actually looking at a detail, a close-up of part of the spiral relief around the column. And it's really interesting because it doesn't just show, for example, the military power and victory of the Romans, but instead shows the whole process of the invasion of the war. It shows the gathering of supplies, the building of fortifications and bridges, etc. It shows the army marching. It shows everything. It shows all of this. And Trajan is omnipresent. He is shown throughout the entire process as overseeing his armies. And so we have this constant sense of what's going on. And the lower part of this register, by the way, we can see one of the most famous parts of this. And you can actually see a river god. You can see this large figure with flowing hair, and this represents the Danube. And to the right of that, you can see boats lashed together. And this is actually the famous bridge that Apollodorus of Damascus figured out how to create, with a series of boats connected. And this is being used to shuttle the Roman army across the river. So what we're looking at here is an image of the markets that were designed by Apollodorus of Damascus. And these, again, are adjacent to Trajan's Forum. And these markets are really just a remarkable thing to look at today, because even though these are ancient, these date to, between 100 and 112, the Common Era, these bear a striking resemblance, really, to some of the types of structures that we would expect to see today. So what we're looking at here in this case is kind of a curve shape, a hemispherical structure with a series of other structures that go back into the hill. It's actually carved into the Quirinal Hill, one of the 7 famous hills of Rome, and really only possible with the use of architectural structures or techniques rather, like concrete. Apollodorus of Damascus actually had to remove a huge portion of the hill in order to build these structures as well, and carve well into the existing landscape in order to make room for this structure. But what we're looking at here is a structure that includes this series of shops and offices. They're built using barrel vaults and concrete and brick, and it really resembles a modern shopping mall, really, in a lot of ways. Another view here from a little bit more of a distance, and you can get an idea of the scale here. Some of the structures in the back are not part of the actual market. There's some medieval and also other structures that date to a later period than the market itself, but you can get an idea here really of how it's laid out. And it included administrative offices as well as shops. And here you can also see in the foreground some of the ruins or remains of the Forum itself. Again, much of which is destroyed and actually bisected diagonally now also by a modern road. So this particular view here, I think, really gives us an idea of just how similar this type of structure was really to a modern shopping mall. Here we are in an upper level. You can see the shops to the right. And to the left is a balcony which overlooks a lower level with additional shopping. And so it's really pretty striking just how similar this is to a lot of very contemporary structures that serve essentially the same function. This next structure wasn't actually built by Apollodorus of Damascus, but was certainly influenced by his style. We're looking, of course, here at the famous temple to all gods, the Pantheon. The Pantheon is famous for a number of reasons. One is that it is one of the best preserved buildings from ancient history. The drainage system, for example, still works. When it rains, water comes inside through the oculus and still drains just fine using the original Roman technology. It's a beautifully preserved building in many ways, and incredibly impressive due to its scale, its complexity, and also its engineering. The structure is built largely out of concrete, and the Roman mastery of this medium is seen here probably more clearly than anywhere else. The Romans, in the building of the Pantheon, didn't simply use one type of concrete to create the whole thing, but in fact used a variety of different formats. The concrete in the base, in the drum, is, for example, much denser, much heavier than the concrete in the dome itself. And the dome itself gets thinner and thinner as it reaches the apex, there where you see the hole, the oculus. They used a concrete mix with pumice to make it lighter as it gets higher up, and heavier types of material for the lower reaches. And these walls are massively thick. So we view the Pantheon today very differently than it would have been viewed in ancient history. When we look at it now, for example, in this aerial view, we can see the drum, we can see the dome over the top, and we can see the portico, which projects out of the front. And this is a little bit different than what would have been seen in ancient times. This would have been surrounded by a colonnade, which would have met with the portico. And while it's obvious today, looking at this is a round or central plan building, approaching this in ancient history when it was still surrounded by its original structures, that would not have been apparent, and you would have been probably quite surprised to walk into what appeared to be a fairly regular temple to find an enormous circular interior space. So the Pantheon that we see today is in fact a building that replaces an earlier structure. There had been an earlier temple here which was destroyed and then rebuilt, and the new building that we see was created somewhere between 118 and about 125 of the Common Era. And the patron of the structure was Hadrian, who was the emperor who took the Roman throne after Trajan. And it again is a remarkable building for a number of ways, a number of reasons rather. And here we can see the Pantheon kind of from street level. One of the things also interesting to note is that our view of this is quite different than it would have been in antiquity in terms of elevation as well. Street level has risen dramatically in Rome as things have accumulated over centuries and centuries, millennia. And the building actually sits lower today than it would have relative to ground level back in ancient times. But here we can see the massive portico and the drum sitting behind it. You can also just make out the Latin inscription on the front of the structure. There's another image here, a little bit better picture, and you can also get another view of the Pantheon as you approach it. It differs from Greek temples in many ways too, you can see here, in that, again, we have the drum behind, but we do still have the pedimental structure. We have the colonnade across the front. And there's lots and lots of little holes all over that top section where you would expect to find pedimental statuary if we were talking about a Greek temple. But none of the original material from that surface persists. We know that, for example, on the interior, there were also bronze or gold lunettes that were within the interior coffers that we'll look at a little bit later here that no longer survive. So some of the materials that were on the structure originally may have been stripped sometime during the later period, the medieval period, for example. So here we have an actual translation of what the text across the front of the facade here says. It says, Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, in his third consulate made it. And you may remember that I mentioned a moment ago that Hadrian was in fact the patron. And that's because Agrippa had been the patron of the previous structure. And Hadrian here is really paying his respects to Agrippa, who had been a consul earlier during the construction of the previous temple. So here we're looking at a couple of different views of the Pantheon. Now this is what we would call a central plan structure, and it's pretty much impossible or extremely rare to find an example of a central plan structure that is purely 100% central. Now when we say central, what we really mean is that it is symmetrical around a radial axis. In other words, it's really based around a center point rather than along a line. And here we can clearly find the center point, which is the center of the dome. Now, granted, the portico doesn't match that concept, but no buildings are really perfectly radially symmetrical in this manner. And so the Pantheon is a very good example, though, of the concept of what a central plan building looks like, what it's all about. And this is one of the most copied, one of the most essential buildings when it comes to the history of architecture. There are just an innumerable quantity of buildings around the world today that can trace their lineage directly to the Pantheon. You may also notice in this set of drawings that you can actually see a double pediment. And if you look in that top left view for a minute there, you can notice that there's kind of an additional pediment right above the first. This is actually because the original height of the pediment was intended to be quite a bit taller than it is today. But there was a little mishap. The original columns, which were intended for the structure, were lost. And new columns were acquired, and they were shorter than the intended columns. And so the height of the portico had to be lowered in order to accommodate them. The columns are still enormous. And by the way, they're made of a single piece of granite each. They're monolithic. The Greeks didn't do that, by the way. The Greek columns that we always see when we look at major structures there were done in drums and stacked. But these columns are single pieces of granite, which, by the way, were imported from Egypt. So here we're looking at, again, a plan view and also at the interior of the Pantheon. The interior of the Pantheon is beautifully paved and revetted in marble. The upper part, the coffers, were in fact originally probably, it probably included either bronze or gold lunettes in each of those square recesses you see, which are important structurally in that they reduce the amount of weight in the dome, and yet also because of the rib-like structure that pattern creates, it reinforces the strength of the dome. So the beautiful patterning that we see here, by the way, is not accidental. You'll notice a repetition of squares and circles, and this is intent on focusing our eyes on the mathematics, the proportions, the ratios, which are an essential part of the design of the Pantheon. Another thing about this is really quite striking is that this interior volume could actually hold a sphere, a perfect sphere that was 142 feet in diameter. And this was the largest interior space in the world when it was created, and remained the largest interior space in the world pretty much until the modern era. It was quite some time before anyone was able to eclipse this. Now, some other important things that are important to note about this structure. You'll note the oculus above, the opening. It is not covered, it is open. And as a result, water does pass through, but it is drained out by the existing technology that was included by the Romans when it was built. The sunlight that comes through the oculus moves across the floor and the dome of the Pantheon throughout the day, and acts almost like a sundial in that respect, which is pretty remarkable as well. This was, as I mentioned, a temple to all gods, but the really chief among these, of course, is Jupiter, Julius Caesar. Of course, remember, Roman emperors were deified upon death unless they weren't very popular, and then their memory was damned, like we see with Nero, for example, which we call damnatio memoriae. But this was a very popular thing to do, of course, with well-known and well-established emperors. Augustus, for example, had several temples throughout the empire that were dedicated to him, called Augustaeum. We also have some other famous people who are really related with this structure that are much more recent. By recent, of course, in this case, I'm referring to the Renaissance. This structure is also known to be the tomb of Raphael, who's buried in one of the alcoves nearby. So on my last visit to Italy, I managed to get some pictures of some of the elements that we're discussing here. This is actually a side view, not something that most tourists go out of the way, I think, to find. But here you can see the height of the existing portico and how it doesn't quite match with the original intended height. You can see that additional layer up above, and this shows us again the fact that the replacement columns were just a little bit shorter than the originals, and they had to adjust the height of the structure accordingly. So here we have a picture of the interior again, and you can see the oculus, the light moving down through across the coffers. The oculus again is the eye that allows light to enter the structure, and the coffers here are these recessed panels. And these again are not just strictly decorative, but they lighten the dome without really sacrificing any strength. And here, by the way, is the Tomb of Raphael, one of course the most famous of all of the Renaissance painters that we'll be discussing much later in our course. So here we're looking at a famous statue of Marcus Aurelius, an equestrian statue. And the original is now actually located inside of the Capitoline Museum, and a copy now sits outside on the Capitoline Hill on the pedestal that we're looking at here today. But the original structure, the original statue is made of bronze, and it's a remarkable example for a number of reasons. First off, it's remarkable that it survives. It's a massive bronze equestrian statue, so there aren't many of those around that survive anymore from this early. Really, this is the only one that survives from this early of a period. We know there were others, but this one, because of the fact that it was actually misidentified, it was believed to be Constantine. It was basically spared by the Christians later as a result of that misidentification, rather than being melted down to make other things. So, but we know now that it's actually Marcus Aurelius, and this famous statue, it's quite massive. It's 11'6" in height, and it shows us here Marcus Aurelius astride his horse. And it's shown this in this really unusual set of proportions. If you look carefully at it, one of the things you'll note is that if Marcus Aurelius was actually to get off of his horse and stand up, this is either an enormous man or a very small horse. And more than likely what this is intended to do is to really show his power and authority. You'll note that he's sitting astride this horse with a great sense of ease. He doesn't even really seem to be hanging on, doesn't even be bothering to pay any attention to the horse. It just assumed that he is in complete control. And this could be an allegory. The horse in this case may refer really to Rome. And Marcus Aurelius is shown as this incredibly powerful leader. He's shown here reaching out almost as if giving benediction or offering mercy. At one point there would have been a crouching barbarian under the horse's hoof here. So it's intended to show essentially Marcus Aurelius's power, his authority, his strength, his grandeur. And this is a statue that really sets a precedent. It's something that many later rulers and leaders attempt, often with shallow imitations, to really capture for themselves. And so this is a tremendous example of how Roman art can also be used as a propaganda tool in order to communicate the power and efficacy of their leaders. And we see this going all the way back, for example, to the imagery that we've seen talking about Augustus and Augustus of Prima Porta, and how that was used as a way to convey his power and authority. So after the end of the Antonine dynasty, we have the beginning of a new period in Roman history, which we refer to as the Late Empire. And this begins with the Severan dynasty. And the first emperor of the Severan dynasty is a man by the name of Septimus Severus. And he's actually from Africa. And Septimus Severus rules for a period of time, has a couple of children, by the way, named Caracalla and Geta. Caracalla ends up assassinating his older brother, Geta, in order to assume the throne after the death of his father, and actually damns his memory. Again, the damnatio memoriae that I've mentioned. So it's interesting, when we look at this period in history, we'll see examples of, for example, things like images that are family portraits where one of the members has been erased. Triumphal arches where, again, Geta has been struck from the imagery, leaving only Caracalla. This was kind of a typical Roman practice. But after the Severan dynasty, things get pretty messy, and we have a period in time that we refer to, where the emperors we just kind of refer to generally as the soldier emperors, and we have one after another being elected emperor or raised up by their troops and then assassinated, and this happens over and over and over again. Then finally, a man by the name of Diocletian becomes emperor. He's elected emperor by his troops, if you will, and placed into power, but he knows this is going to be a bad thing, so he does something that's pretty intelligent, really, which is he decides to share power with his four greatest rivals. And so they set up a new system, and they call it the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. Diocletian is one of these four tetrarchs. You also have a man by the name of Constantinus Chlorus, who's what we call the Caesar of the West. You have a Caesar of the West, Caesar of the East. You have an Augustus of the West, an Augustus of the East. And this power structure works, actually, and really until Diocletian's retirement, it's effective. And then things fall apart again, of course. And eventually, who emerges from the dust after that is a man by the name of Constantine I, who is the son of Constantinus Chlorus. What we're looking at here is the Arch of Septimus Severus. And it's a great example of how the Romans used the Triumphal Arch specifically as a tool of propaganda. So we haven't really talked about the Triumphal Arch yet, but this is a really essential Roman form, and it's an important concept. And the Triumphal Arch is something that carries on a lasting history, really. So originally what these are for, the Triumphal Arch is something that the Romans would build after conquering an enemy or in celebration of an important milestone, whatever. But the Triumphal Arch is symbolic. It actually references visually the yoke of an ox. And so these are intended to kind of send the message that, you've been conquered and you are now the slaves. You are now the oxen of the Roman Empire. And these were used for a variety of things. I mean, originally they're used to commemorate battle. And we see, for example, the Arch of Titus, which tells us about the spoils of Jerusalem and how Titus was successful in his war there. But this one is intended for the Severan family. This was erected by Septimus Severus. And there are other examples of arches that commemorate things like the building of roads and a variety of other things as well. But this one's really quite interesting for a lot of reasons. It has a lot of sculptural decoration, for one, and some of the sculptural decoration has in fact been modified in a very specific manner, as we'll see in the next image. So here we're looking at a relief from the Arch of Septimus Severus. And there's a couple things about this that are kind of essential for us to understand. One is that the means of representation here has changed. If we think back to the way that the ancient Greeks would have represented something on the Panathenaic festival frieze, for example, we have this real sense of depth and space. But here we see things rendered in a way that is much flatter. Images are stacked, they're layered, and they're shown in a manner that does not necessarily suggest realistic space. We can really see that if we look at Septimus Severus and his family members there in the center in the chariot. And you can see how stretched out and unusual things appear. And that's because this is a case where artists are intending to communicate. The art here has become essentially more communicative than illustrative. It's not so much intended to show us realistic space, but instead it's become didactic. It's intended to tell us a story in order to communicate something very specific. This particular work is really quite important as well, because if we look in the middle there, we can see Septimus Severus flanked on either side by his sons. We see Caracalla on our right, and on the left is an image whose head has been struck, and that is, of course, Geta. We look at this arch, we can see that the text has been changed and scraped out in some places, as well as statuary like this. It's deliberately damaged and vandalized in a way to eliminate Geta from the composition. So again, talking about how art is changing, how style is shifting, we can see that very clearly in this example. This is a really famous sarcophagus, and it's massive. It's just huge. The sarcophagus itself is 5 feet high, and that's not including the pedestals there that it's on. This structure is a sarcophagus it's known as the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. And it's named after Cardinal Ludovisi, who at one point had owned it in Rome. And what we see here is this incredibly complex, deep, sophisticated image of battle. We have here the Romans engaged in battle with their barbaric counterparts, and of course the Romans are winning. We see a Roman man at the top there raising his arm up and reaching outward. We can see trumpet players blowing their horns on the top right. We can see horses engaged in battle, men being trampled. But it's incredibly complex and incredibly deeply carved in many places. And you have this unbelievable sense of complexity and movement. But the sense of space here is so compact, it's so dense, that it doesn't really read as incredibly realistic. And yet it still communicates a tremendous amount to us. And this is really typical of this kind of late imperial style that we see in ancient Rome. So here we can see a detail of this Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. And again, you get an idea just of the complexity of the imagery. It's also interesting to note, by the way, that at this period in history, Christianity starts to become a little more popular, although it's still kind of an underground religion at this point. But one of the things that kind of comes with that is that inhumation, or actual burial of the physical body, starts to become a lot more popular. And as a result, sarcophagi like this become much more prevalent. So here we're looking at an example of statuary which today is actually located just outside of St. Mark's in Venice. But this is an image of the 4 Tetrarchs. And here we're looking at Diocletian, we're looking at Constantinus Chlorus, and of the 2 other members of the Tetrarchy. And so one of the things that's really striking about this image is that none of the individual members here really are recognizable. They're all rendered pretty much the same. They're shown in this tight cluster, they're grasping each other, they're rendered identically, and they're not rendered really in a realistic or accurate manner. It's a very simplified image. If we look at this and kind of think about how different this is than, for example, the equestrian portrait of Marcus Aurelius, or even, of course, if we talk about Augustus of Prima Porta and the idealized Polycletian imagery we see there, this is so dramatically different. And that's because it has an intended purpose that differs. It's intended to show unity, consistency. It's intended to show that these 4 men really are essentially identical, that they are one, and that is a political message. And so we see the function of art here really reflected in the style that's chosen and utilized by the artists. And it shifts dramatically away from earlier forms of Greek idealism and instead into a much more didactic and functional style. And this really plays an important role later, particularly when we talk about Christian iconography, which will really take its cues in many ways from late Imperial Roman sculpture. Here we're looking at one of the best known examples really of Roman propaganda. This is the Triumphal Arch of Constantine. So Constantine had this created between about 312 and 315 of the Common Era. Constantine, as we've talked about previously, took power and became emperor after the end of the Tetrarchy. But a little bit of background about that. So we mentioned Diocletian. Diocletian, again, had formed this alliance with some of his rivals. Constantine was the son of one of those tetrarchs. And he ended up invading Italy in 312 and defeated Maxentius. Maxentius was another one of the original tetrarchs. And he did so, he claimed, in the name of the Christian God. And he claimed to see a sign in the sky, the Chi-Rho Iota, the letters of Christ's name in Greek, and took that as a sign of his victory. And he actually ended up legalizing Christianity, which was a big deal in ancient Rome. And we also see that Constantine, does some other things here which are really quite substantial in terms of politics and in terms of Christianity. He's baptized on his deathbed, the first Roman emperor to become a Christian, and he also builds a series of structures, including the old St. Peter's outside of Rome, which become obviously very important symbols and important structures relative to this new faith that is becoming quite popular in Rome at this period in history. So Constantine has this triumphal arch created, this triple arch, and he does some pretty interesting things with it, architecturally speaking. So it's a basic, although quite large, triumphal arch when we look at it in terms of its layout, but its sculptural decoration is where things really begin to get interesting. It is full of sculptural decoration. It's absolutely covered. We have these roundels on the sides. We have all sorts of panels all over the sides and the exterior of the structure that reference quite a variety of different things. And when we look at this carefully, we actually find that some of the statuary does not appear to be original to Constantine's period in history. So when we look at the sculptural decoration that we find on the Arch of Constantine, what we actually see are roundels and panels and statuary that largely date to the reigns of Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, and Trajan. And these images were actually stolen from triumphal arches and structures that were dedicated to these earlier rulers. And the image of the emperor recarved into the likeness of Constantine. And we see that here in the boar hunt. We see it in a variety of other images. And it's really pretty striking how widespread this is, how many different scenes we see that are, famous scenes from Roman history where Constantine has essentially inserted himself. And this raises some interesting questions. Why would he do this? Well, it certainly has a direct and deliberate political intent. Constantine is attempting here really to identify himself as Rome, as all of the history, all of the successes and victories, and all of the triumphs of the Roman Empire are embodied in him, in the chosen emperor. And this is, quite a statement politically, but that is more than likely the intent, really, of this structure. In terms of style, we can really clearly see which are earlier reliefs, which have this much more idealistic, Greek-inspired sense of form, proportion, and space, as compared to later reliefs. We can actually see in some of these images, if you look at the lower panels, very squat, cookie-cutter-like figures. And these are figures that are contemporaneous with the reign of Constantine. And these, of course, are this much later, this late imperial style, which, as we've mentioned, will have a significant impact later on Christian iconography and Christian art. Here we can see one of the reliefs that dates to Constantine's reign. And it's been damaged. Constantine would have been sitting in the middle here, and you can see his head no longer exists. But this is an image of him distributing largesse, or giving out funds really to the poor. And if you look at the figures to the sides, to either side of him, you can see how they have this very squat, dwarfish figure. They are cookie cutter like and identical, and they're reaching up to receive the, really the tribute from the emperor here. And so when we look at the way these are rendered, it differs dramatically from the earlier style. And yet it is a style that is extremely didactic and extremely communicative, which is its very deliberate intent. Constantine is also very well known for some other structures and other things that were created during his reign. One of these is the Basilica Nova, a famous building that we'll take a look at in just a moment. Within the Basilica Nova was a tremendous statue of Constantine, which only survives today in fragments. And we're looking here at one of these fragments. This massive statue is what we're looking at here really is just its head, obviously. There's a drawing there on the left to give you an idea of how it would have been arranged. It really kind of recalls Phidias's famous statue of Athena. To give you an idea of scale, the head that's there on the right is in fact 8'6" in height. So this would have been truly massive, and it would have sat within the massive structure of the Basilica Nova that we'll be looking at here in detail. The Basilica Nova today is a ruin, and really, some portion of the walls remain, but most of the structure is no longer intact. But that said, looking at this image here, we can get some idea from this drawing what it may have originally appeared like. It is a different form of basilica than we've seen before. The concrete here is used with barrel vaulting to create these massive apse-like structures. An enormous central area, so it would have been an incredibly large building. The Basilica Nova is another structure that had a tremendous impact upon later Christian architecture. It also utilized a clerestory to allow light into the interior. It was actually begun by Maxentius, but completed by Constantine during his reign. And this structure, again, is quite famous because of the relationship that it has with later Christian structures. So here in this photograph of the ruins, you can get some idea of what remains, and also a little bit of a better idea of scale, because this is a really, really massive building. And you can see these enormous apse recesses that are coffered, those three enormous dome-like structures you can see there in the background. This building would have, again, as mentioned previously, been quite a bit taller than this because of the clerestory and the central roof, which would have been raised higher than what we're looking at here, and again would have contained that enormous statue of Constantine. So although Constantine legalized Christianity and became a Christian himself, he did not build Christian structures within Rome. This would have been probably quite controversial and may have eroded his power. But we do see structures that were created by Constantine certainly adopted to Christian use. This example here is a building called the Aula Palatina, which was built in Trier, Germany. And this structure, while originally intended essentially as a part of a palace complex, this was intended to be a basilica-like audience hall. But it has been converted to a church. It's built with concrete but faced in brick, and this exposed brick on the outside that we see here was typical of late Roman architecture, and certainly also closely resembles early Christian architecture. The interior here of the Aula Palatina also shows how readily, convertible something like this is into Christian architecture. In this fact, you can see a cross hanging because this building was turned into a church. You can see that the curved end here on the east end, which of course is an apse, the diaphragm arch, which supports the roof, and all of these structures became really perfect for addressing, Christian congregations. Earlier, prior to this, most forms of worship didn't involve congregational gathering like we see with Christian societies. And so the need for a structure that could accommodate this was easily filled by the design, by the form of the Roman basilica.